here in the Pacific Northwest.
Got music in there. Greetings, everyone. I think we're ready to go. We had a very short introduction.
Yeah.
But, that's all right. That's all right. We're still the Independent Producers Organization and all part of Portland Community Media.
That's pcmtv.org.
Okay, all right.
How about that? That's beautiful sky there.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Some of this stuff gets better all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have a show on overpopulation, and our guest will be coming from Oklahoma. We'll find out when he gets here. He's going to call in about 4 or 5 minutes.
Is he the same fellow that did this once before?
Yeah, we've done this before, and you know what's happened is some of the ideas and concepts and the things to do with overpopulation have changed so fast that even he has difficulty keeping up with what's needed to be done in order to get the population down.
What do you mean it's changed? The statistics about how many people are on the
Figure
planet?
Statistics, right. Figure that, because he's reversed himself already on the number of people.
It's about 7 billion, I think, now.
Well, that too, but I'm talking about per family.
Oh, okay.
There was a thing a while back where it was just everybody, all these scientists and whatever, were saying stop at 2. Well, forget it. That put the people all over the planet.
Well, that's what they were saying in the 70s, the zero population growth. Each person, the man and the woman, has 1 kid.
That actually,
And that comes up with 2 per family.
over time,
That's gone down, huh?
You really have to stop doing it. How else in 12 years' time could the world population have grown 1 billion? That's just...
Well, you know, a 7% rise in anything doubles in 7 years or something
All right,
like
now
that.
that's...
I think we've got the phone call maybe. He just gave us the flashing light, so. A caller, are you there?
Hello?
Hello.
David.
Yes.
Oh, yes. You know, David is on a cell phone and it works great.
All right.
Just great.
It isn't always that way.
That's right. That's right. I think I want you to tell us a little more about your name of your magazine, or what you publish, rather, and to go into what some of your purposes.
Okay, yeah, I'm having a little trouble understanding you. When we first made the connection, you guys were crystal clear. I could hear your voices just fine.
Oh, really?
But now there's a lot of distortion.
Well, let's hope it's on this end and not your cell phone.
No, it's not on this end. I'm pretty sure it's on your end. It's hard to understand you. So if there could be some adjustment made, that would be a very big.
Yeah, your voice is a little muddy, but you're pretty clear.
You're still pretty clear.
Yeah, you're much better now than you were. It was highly distorted. You were asking about our organization. Well, our organization is a worldwide organization focused on solving overpopulation. That's the most important message. One of them from our group is that overpopulation is really solvable. There are places in the world today, for example, regions and countries where they have dramatically reduced their birth rate successfully voluntarily. And Thailand is a classic example. 45, 50 years ago, they were averaging 7 children per couple in Thailand. And today it's well under 2, and they got it down for a while there. They got it down just pretty close to 1.5 average per couple. And if the whole world followed their lead by 2100, there would be roughly about 5 billion, maybe 5.5 billion people on the planet, instead of the 11 billion that the UN and other groups are saying we will have in 2100 if we don't change course and wake up to the reality.
How do you think Thailand did that?
Well, they did it with, it's interesting, it's fascinating really. They did it with a lot of humor. They set up a program, they went to every home in Thailand. They demythologized family planning because in the Thai culture 45 and 50 years ago, it was well known that with the kind of modest culture that they had, the whole subject of family planning was a completely taboo subject. You know, you couldn't even talk in public at all about family planning. And one man really led the way on this. His name is Michai Viravedya, and he set up programs with. He had the priest. They blessed condoms. They sprinkled holy water on condoms. He used a great deal of humor in his program. For example, he set up a program with the police department called Cops and Rubbers. And every time the cop would hand somebody a ticket, they handed them a condom at the same time. And taxi drivers hand out condoms. As I say, they went to every home in Thailand. They turned the whole culture around, and Thai families came to realize that it was in their best interest to have only one or two or no children because of the very poor culture that they had, you know, the poor conditions of so many people in Thailand. So it's been a huge transformation. He thought outside the box. He really just pulled out all the stops, and eventually he became. He was asked after doing this program for several years. He was even asked by one of the governments that came into power in Thailand to join them. So they did it as a voluntary program. They completely turned upside down, you might say, the entire culture and the understanding, where these people were having 7 kids. They couldn't feed them properly. They couldn't put clothes on them properly. On average, that means many women back in those days, you know, many women were having 8, 9, 10 kids. The average 7, and so
They couldn't
it's been
stop.
a tremendous victory.
They didn't know how to stop or control it.
Well, it was culturally, yeah. Well, why are the Thai people so much smarter than the rest of the world?
Well, I think Michai is owed a huge debt on this. He thought outside the box, and he transformed the culture. And we don't have the same. For example, we don't have the same exact issues and challenges in the United States culture that they had there, but we have different ones. And I think that it behooves us. We've also got to be thinking way outside the box about how we transform the American awareness and understanding. For example, I can't tell you how many Americans I run into who think that, some of whom think, well, you know, there is a population problem in the world. Yeah, I've heard about it. But they think it's over somewhere else. And they don't realize that, for example, the United States population at now over 320 million people is probably between 2 and 2.5 times overpopulated right now in the U.S. In other words, the resources of the U.S. and the planet sustainably long term can probably only support 100 to 120, 130 million Americans during the next 50 and 100 years and beyond. And by the way, that's not at a current consumption level. We're talking 100, 120, 30 million people in the U.S. long term at a consumption level maybe only half to 2/3 of what it is today in the United States. More like an average European, or maybe even a little less. So so the U.S. is significantly overpopulated right now. But of course, that's not the perception, is it, of most Americans? Because they look outside, they get up in the morning, everything looks like there's plenty of resources in many parts of the country, but they're not sustainable long term. We're burning through many fossil fuels. We know that, the oil, the coal numbers. We've already burned through on the planet the vast majority of the best coal, called the anthracite coal. You know, that's the highest burning, the hottest burning coal. We've burned through, we've devoured most of the anthracite coal, and in many parts of the world today, they still have coal in some parts, but they don't have that really high burning anthracite that can only be used. That's the only kind of coal that can be used for certain uses, like, for example, smelting iron and things like that. You have to have really, really hot coal for a lot of these kinds of things. Now we're burning up the bituminous and the subbituminous and the lignite coal, which is much less energy compact, and we're gobbling up fresh water. We're over pumping fresh water. You know, over half the people on the planet today, over 7.2 billion people, over half the people on the planet today are in countries where fresh water tables are falling right now, including the U.S. You know, the Ogallala Aquifer in the Midwest.
And California.
The American Southwest, California, the American Southwest, the American Southeast. All of those areas have had some real challenges in the last few years, and they're going to have many more really hard times unless we dramatically reduce birth so that total population begins to drift back down toward a truly sustainable range in the U.S. of, say, 150 million people, and in the world, drifts back down to about 2 to 2.5, maybe 3 billion maximum, instead of the 7.2 billion we've got now.
Mm-hmm. You know, it occurs to me, you know, like you say, you look out your window and it looks like we're a pretty affluent society, but
have everything.
But I've seen statistics where, you know, we're way down on the range of child mortality, way down on the range. We don't have the best education system in the world. Besides child mortality, we have a lot of children that go to bed hungry, and we have to give them school lunches. So, you know,
Right.
either we're not producing enough food, or we have a serious distribution problem. One or the other, probably both.
Well, we've got globally, we've got both. I mean, even if the food, here's the thing, even if food were distributed evenly throughout the world right now, there might be enough temporarily, short term, to feed everybody a modest level of food. But here's the real kicker, guys. We're not growing that food sustainably long term.
Right.
We are growing it at the expense of fresh water tables. We're growing it at the expense of fertilizers. And by the way, there's a wonderful gentleman based in Boston named Jeremy Grantham. He's an economist. He specializes in he's an asset money manager. His firm manages over $100 billion of people's assets based in Boston, and he is one of the world's leading experts in the last several decades on economic bubbles. He has successfully predicted most, if not all, of the major economic bubbles in the world for the last several decades in the world. And he has said, I've heard him in a couple of talks. He gave one at Yale last November that's on the internet, actually, that anybody can go up and watch for about an hour. It's a marvelous talk. It's a stunning and sobering talk about, in fact, if anybody sends me an email, just go to our website, worldpopulationbalance.org, and you can find on there a link to send me an email. If you just send an email to our office, I'll send you the link to Jeremy Grantham's talk at Yale last fall. And this is one of the main points he made. And I've heard him say this even at a conference in London 3 or 4 years ago. He said, as much of a pain as water shortages are going to be on the planet in the coming years, fresh water, because they are, an even bigger pain, he is convinced, and because of his expertise as a leading economist and so on, he believes that fertilizers that we are using in massive amounts all over the world today, mostly phosphorus, potash, things like that, those are going to become an even shorter supply, and they are a non-renewable resource. You know, potash, phosphorus, we put those on the soil, they stay on the soil for a season or two, and then massive amounts of them wash off the soil into the water system and eventually into the ocean, where they are lost for future use to help grow the incredible amounts of food that we have had to be growing on the planet to try to feed 7+ billion people, but it's all unsustainable. It's not sustainable. He goes on to say that he believes that if we don't change our ways very, very soon, including dramatically reducing human numbers on the planet, that we will be, and eventually on the planet, there will be only enough food and resources to support 1 to 2 billion people. And as he puts it, we'll be back, the people on the planet at that time will be back to what he describes as medieval recycling, because we will just plain not have the resources.
What was, before we go any further, what was that website again? Rural population?
World. Like the globe, yeah. The name of our organization is World Population Balance.
Yeah.
.org. Okay.
You just go there, worldpopulationbalance.org, and send me an email and say, I'd like the Jeremy Grantham the YouTube that he gave at Yale last fall. And while you're there, I would love to encourage all of your viewers to also sign the Sustainable Population Pledge that we have on our website.
Oh, yeah.
It's a simple little thing to do. We've designed it, we've written it so that every person on the planet can sign this pledge. In other words, if somebody's had one child, they can sign the pledge, pledging to have no more children. We have a saying at World Population Balance that one-child families can save humanity, because here's why. Because a two-child average, most people don't realize this, that if we got the fertility rate on the planet right now down to an average of 2 children per couple, do you know that total population on the planet would go from 7.2 billion, where it is now, on up to about 9 billion at a two-child average before it would stop increasing. Before it would stop increasing. And then it would not drop back below 8 billion people for another 200 years. Well, you know, the planet's resources don't have 200 years. Humanity does not have 200 years in which to dramatically reduce total human numbers on the planet back down to a couple of billion people in order to be truly sustainable.
What is the average of children per family worldwide?
Right now, it's up above 2. It's, you know, between 2 and 2. I don't know the exact number recently, but I think it's worldwide. I think it's in the neighborhood of 2, 2.5.
2.5.
2.5.
In your title, what does balance? The word balance mean?
Well, balance. Obviously, what we're talking about is getting human numbers on the planet back down, Richard, to a level that is in balance with the resources on the planet, both the renewable and the non-renewable resources, so that they can provide long-term, sustainably into the far into the future, so that these resources can provide for human numbers on the planet. And by the way, too, if I have another something that I can send everybody who's interested for free. It's a book. It's in a PDF format, so I can email it out to everybody. There's hard copies available as well, but the book is free to everybody who'd like it. And that is a book written by my good friend John Howe in Maine, who is he was an engineer in his whole career, and now he's retired as an engineer. But he's a you might say he's a part-time gentleman farmer now in Maine. And over the last 20 years, he's been so alarmed and concerned about overpopulation and overconsumption that he's written a book that goes into detail about what he calls the end of fossil energy and per capita oil, and the fact that he lays out in great detail, and he's an engineer that kind of likes to look at these numbers. He lays out why we need to go from our present 7+ billion people in the next 50, 60, 70 years. We need to dramatically reduce our total human numbers on the planet. If we want future society to be sustainable, we need to reduce total human numbers back down to the range of 2 billion. And at the same time, one of the other really big things we need to accomplish is to transition as fast as possible off of renewable, non-renewable fossil fuel onto renewable. And and in the last 20 years, it's interesting, he has converted 4 vehicles on his farm as a hobby kind of thing. He has converted 4 vehicles to solar battery power. The first one, the smallest of the 4, was a golf cart. And then he did a tractor, a farm-all tractor, and then next he did an automobile, and the 4th one is a larger tractor. And he has done calculations in this book, and again, you can just email me and ask me to email you a copy of it, a PDF of it. He has done calculations that substantiate that if we were to dramatically reduce human numbers on the planet to the neighborhood of 2 billion, and at the same time get off of fossil fuels onto renewables, that the renewables could be ramped up enough by that time to provide a decent kind of quality of life for about 2 billion people. But it won't happen. It won't happen. Humanity will not have a decent quality of life 50, 60, 80 years from now unless we dramatically bring down the total human numbers on the planet.
Yeah, I know. I just can't get over this thing where in 12 years, an additional 1 billion people appear. How are we going to correct that fact alone?
Well,
getting 1 billion down to.
Yeah, great question. What we have to do, I mean, the only way we can do it humanely. See, there's a lots of ways it can happen inhumanely.
Yeah,
for
right.
famines, wars, disease, misery, suffering, natural disasters.
And it will eventually.
It'll come if we don't do something.
If we don't do it humanely by dramatically reducing birth, then it will come inhumanely with those other things. And of course, that's what keeps me inspired to work every day to help Americans wake up and begin to take more action, group action, to really dramatically reduce births on both in the United States and the rest of the world, in order to get us headed in the same direction that Thailand is. I've got one prop that I want to turn on for everybody here and let you hear this. This metronome is ticking right now at about a little less than 150 beats a minute. All right. Every time this metronome ticks, every single tick represents an additional human passenger on the planet right now. In other words, every time it ticks, there have been a couple of people been born, a couple of babies been born, but another person has died, and so the net gain is 150 a minute. That means that since 1 hour ago, the population on the whole planet has increased by about 9,000 people. Since yesterday at the same time, human population on the planet has increased by over 200,000 people. And I ask audiences all the time to raise their hand if they think that in the last 24 hours, while human numbers on the planet have increased by over 200,000 people, I ask them to raise their hand if they think that the amount of fresh water in the last 24 hours has increased to keep pace with 200,000 more people, or the amount of farmland and topsoil, or the amount of fish in the ocean, or the amount of forest cover, or you could go on with a whole long list of things. Not only have none of those, nobody ever raises their hand, by the way, not only have none of those things increased in the last 24 hours, but I ask my audiences all the time, what's happened instead? And of course, the no-brainer answer is they've all declined. They've all decreased. That's why the people like the Dalai Lama and other world leaders on the planet are saying that the world's biggest problem is population.
Oh, yes.
Well, it seems
No
to me that
question.
we're going the opposite direction. I mean, you look at what the United States is blocking any movement towards dealing with the carbon footprint problem. Most countries are not dealing with this, and I'm wondering if there's any move to be dealing with this planetarily, like with the UN or anything.
Well, certainly a lot of them are working on it, but here's one of our biggest frustrations about all that focus on global climate change issues, and that is that most of the people that are talking about that, not all of them, but most of them are pretty much ignoring the full truth of the matter, and that is, in other words, you can try to cut per capita global, per capita emissions and all that, like a lot of people are doing, but if you don't also stop the increase in the number of per capitas, as my British friend likes to jokingly say, if you don't stop the increase in the number of people, the population growth on the planet, and actually reverse it, all your noble efforts to reduce per capita global emissions and carbon emissions on it is not going to help much at all. It's not going to accomplish at all what people want to accomplish. By the way, I've just looked up the global fertility rate here, and it's right in the neighborhood of 2.5 children per person per couple right now. So that's the global average.
Uh-huh.
And that will keep increasing the total amount all the time.
Surely, yep. Anything above 0 on the fertility rate. Excuse me. Anything above 2 on the fertility rate, an average of 2, is going to keep increasing it. Anything above 0 on the growth rate, 0% on the growth rate, is going to continue to mean that the population is increasing. So we not only have to stop the population growth, but we have to actually reduce human numbers on the planet. And that's why, by the way, a lot of people that are working on population in other organizations in the country, they're really only most of them are really only telling the American public half the truth. In other words, when they talk all the time about stopping or slowing population growth on the planet to address the population problem, that's only a part of the truth, because the full truth is that stopping the growth is not going to help humanity get through this terrible situation that we're in, this crisis of overpopulation. It's only going to slow down the consumption, the overconsumption, and the depletion of resources, but they're still going to be overconsumed and depleted. The only thing that's going to stop overconsumption of resources and higher levels of pollution is, again, as I said earlier, to dramatically reduce the total number of people on the planet, and that can be done. Overpopulation is solvable humanely.
That's right.
You know, I'm wondering, I don't doubt your statistics, but you say anything above 0 population growth rate, it will add to the population, but doesn't the death rate figure in there somewhere?
No. Zero growth rate. If I said population, well, no, 0. You know, anything above a 0 population growth rate. I don't mean
which factors in the death rate.
Right, factoring in the death rate.
Oh,
right?
okay, I see.
Population growth is a combination of birth minus death. So, in other words, I'm saying if it's anything over 2 on a fertility rate, and a fertility rate and doesn't mean exactly the same as the birth rate, but it's a demographic term that's sort of similar. So anything above an average of 2 fertility rate means that population will not stop increasing and will keep increasing.
Right. And it'll keep going.
Anything above a 0% growth rate means that population is also continuing to increase. So we've got to drop the fertility rate below an average. Getting it down to 2 is not going to solve the problem. We've got to get the fertility rate below an average of 2, which is again why we are saying on our website and in our literature, one-child families can save humanity.
Well, as you mentioned your website again, it wouldn't hurt, because people are surfing the television. They may be just tuning in. But I'd like them to keep mentioning every once in a while
Sure. Our website is worldpopulationbalance.org. World, WORLD, of course. Worldpopulationbalance.org. We are the only population group that we know of on the planet today that is clearly, distinctly saying the following several important full truths. The first full truth is humanity, the world right now, is already significantly overpopulated relative to the planet's renewable resource consumption rate. So therefore, we've got to dramatically stop, not just stop population growth, but reduce human numbers on the planet back down to a truly sustainable range. And the experts are saying that's probably between 1 and 3 billion people. Some experts believe it could be as little as 500 million totally on the whole planet. Some say that maybe there's enough resources, and maybe if 4 billion people really cut their consumption levels down. But you see, another problem with cutting consumption levels is that, and we need to do that in the U.S. I mean, Americans are
No doubt.
rapidly over-consuming right now. However, it's important to keep in mind that for every American on the planet who is over-consuming, there are probably 5 or 10 people in Bangladesh and India and China, and the country list goes on, Afghanistan, who are drastically under-consuming right now, and they don't even have a decent life. I mean, the poorest couple of billion people on the planet today, I no longer use the word live to describe them, because the poorest couple of billion are struggling just to survive on a day-to-day basis, many of them.
And at the
Many
same,
of them. They're malnourished.
yes.
They don't have enough fresh water. I mean, there are tens of thousands of people, for example, in places like Bangladesh, who never set foot on dry ground day after day after day. And that's because the ocean, salty water, the salinated water has seeped in, and now they walk in several inches of water, salt water that they cannot drink, which means if they want to get a fresh water to drink, they've got to walk, some of them, miles each day just to get fresh water.
That's right.
No, it seems,
Terrible.
thinking about what you're saying, though, there's a lot of countries and places in the world that doesn't have a lot of access to the good life. But there's a lot of emerging economies, Brazil and India and China even, that are encouraging the consumer society and the good life, and they're working exactly the opposite of what you're talking about.
Oh, exactly. And thanks for mentioning that, because you've brought me back to a point I was going to try to make a couple minutes ago, and then kind of got off on a side issue. But exactly, you see, as Americans dramatically reduce their consumption rates, and I hope we all do. I mean, my wife and I have worked hard to do that, and we have a lot of friends that are working hard to do that as well. It's important to keep in mind that for every American that's working to reduce their consumption level, there probably are 5 or 10 or 15 people in the other parts of the world who are not in any way trying to reduce their consumption level. In fact, they're striving to do exactly the opposite. Like you say, they're trying to increase their level of consumption of food, increase their consumption of fuel, increase their consumption of clothing and housing, and on and on and on. Why? Because right now, as maybe you've heard this saying, that American dogs and cats, American pets, probably have better nutrition and better health care than the poorest 1 to 2 billion people on the planet today.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that, but I sure wouldn't doubt it.
No, that's right. I'm sure that's right.
No, they have their own hairdressers and things. I mean,
That's true too. Yeah, they have, and some of them have better hair care than
and hygiene and all.
and hygiene. Yeah. So that's why, and of course, why is this such a hard, challenging issue in some ways? Well, it's because throughout all of human history, until just the last 150 years, it was critically important for our ancestors to have lots of children. Why? Because the death rates were so high. Throughout most of human history, families averaged 7, 8, 9, 10 kids in many parts of the world, many parts, as far as births. But only they were lucky because of the high death rates, especially infant mortality rates and so on. They were lucky to have 1 or 2 or 3 of those kids grow up to be adults.
Plus, people didn't live as long.
They didn't have a way to stop them. They didn't have a way to stop. The farmers had the big families. They didn't have any way to stop that.
Right. Yep. My own dad was the oldest of 6 kids, and I'm one of 3. And when I was in college, I came home one time, and I was in a class, School of Natural Resources, at the University of Michigan. And I came home and I was having a conversation with my dad, and I didn't know that he knew anything about the population issue at that time. He'd never mentioned it to me. And I came home after having some readings in one of my school and natural resources policy classes, and I was reading about the population problem in the world. First time I'd ever heard about it. And I came home and talked with my dad, and he said, because he was aware of it too, and he said, if your mother and I had realized when we were having you children, you three, if we'd realized what a problem population growth was on the planet, we would not have had all three of you. And by the way, I'm the youngest of the three.
Uh-oh.
And I fully understood what my dad was saying, and I fully understood that he loved me deeply. It had nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do, with his personal feelings as a father for all three of us. But his awareness, what it had to do with was the fact that only after he had all three of his children did he wake up through reading and so on to the reality, the full truth about what human population growth and now overpopulation is wreaking onto the planet right now. And we are if we don't change course, of course, on this planet, if we don't dramatically reduce our human numbers humanely, voluntarily, and humanely, boy, nature is, the old saying, nature at last. And if we don't change course, humanity, if we don't wake up, if we don't start believing the full truth and demanding the full truth and helping other people understand the full truth, and if we continue to kid ourselves and only listen to the half-truths that a lot of organizations and individuals are putting out there about our overpopulation crisis, if we don't wake up to the full truth and change course, we will leave our children and future generations an incredible catastrophe on the planet.
Well, it seems to me that statistically one could figure this. I mean, we know what percentage of people on the planet are children?
Oh boy, I've not seen that number lately. It varies from country to country, of course.
Because
I can look. Let's see here. I can glance real quickly to give you a number of. I think it's somewhere here. It's under. I think I've got it here from the Population Reference Bureau, where they talk about the number of children under. Here it is. Under 15. Okay, globally, 26. Let's see if that's what is that percent? Yeah, 26% of the people on the planet are under 15.
And it seems to me, adults probably have pretty much had their number of children already, except for maybe here and there. But it's the children they're the ones that are going to have the future children that are going to make or break that number that you're talking about.
Oh, exactly. I speak at a lot of colleges and high schools, and I was out in a college a few months ago. Several young people there got together with me afterwards. They started meeting together with me, and one young lady in particular she and her family lived 5 or 6 years ago. They lived in another country for 3 years outside the U.S. And she is amazing to me. How she's only 19, and she's in college. But boy, does she ever understand the reality, the full truth that overpopulation is threatening her very future life on this planet. The quality of her life. And I was in a high school just about a month ago, just before they got done for the year. In fact, she went with me. She and some others went with me, and I spoke to 6 classes at a high school where a lot of these students, when I explained to them that one-child families can save humanity, and when I explained to them why it was necessary to stop at only one child or maybe none, and in a few cases, a few people having 2 and very few, if any, having more than 2 anymore, why that's so critically important for all of humanity, they got it. They weren't happy to hear it. Some of them weren't happy because they wanted. Some of them said to me when I went back the next day for Q&A session, some of them would raise their hand and they said, "Why is it you told us yesterday that it's important to have only one child? Why can't we have more?" Well, it's easy to explain. It's because if the world average stays at 2, then the total population on the planet, instead of starting to come down, is going to go on up to 9 billion, and it's going to stay at 9 billion, over 8 billion, I mean, for over 200 years into the future. And the resources, the planet doesn't have the resources to sustain 8, 9, 7, 6 billion people.
Yeah, not this is. Oh, go ahead.
You know, one of the things that really kind of gets me, in moving around here in the city, I see so many women with babies, fathers with babies, and it just seems to be endless. And I'm thinking, how can you possibly stop this tsunami of
Well,
of
you know,
growth?
I think that's a great question, and of course, I think we need to do it at a cultural level, just like they did in Thailand, like I was saying earlier. Brazil is another country that's dramatically reduced their births, you know. But you see, in Thailand, it was a whole cultural transformation. We need to have in the U.S. and all around the world, we need to help all people understand the full truth about overpopulation and why we're overpopulated, what it's doing to our resources, in spite of what I call naysayers. You know, there are a lot of so-called naysayers on the planet who believe, who like to try to believe that population numbers are not a problem. And of course, what do they say? Well, they say things like, well, but there's all this technology nowadays, all this fabulous technology. You know, show me a technology that's going to double the amount of fresh water in the Ogallala Aquifer in the American Midwest, or double the amount of fresh water in the Colorado River in the American Southwest. I mean, there is not a technology out there that comes close to doing that.
Not going to do it.
And we've got to, you know, like farmland, in the last 12 months, people are shocked when I explain to them that in the last 12 months on the planet, about 75 million acres of farmland has been lost worldwide to food production. And it's been lost due to two main reasons. There's a few more, but two big ones. Number one, just plain old erosion. You know, there's 75 million acres of land that's no longer producing food due primarily to erosion loss and also to just more people, more sprawl, more development, more roads, more shacks, more shanty towns, more McMansions, more shopping malls, paving over some of the most fertile farmland on the planet. And the year before last, we lost another. The world farmland went down by another 75 million acres. So that's been happening several years in a row now. And of course, every year, the population, just by coincidence, the population increase on the planet is also right around 75 million more people.
And, you know,
So this is wholly unsustainable.
You know, in California, of course, everybody knows there's a drought, and the farmers want their share of the water. They want more than that. And even if water came, it isn't going to be available to them. They're going to want so much water, and the people are going to want so much. There just isn't the possibility of getting it all for so many people.
Surely.
It's just too much.
You know, Dick.
And
While you were talking, I was thinking if any futuristic science fiction type movie we ever watch shows the society that depicts society almost like living in hives. You know, extremely large apartment houses and people jammed together, and that is a future that is not controlling this population. But a future like that would be, you know, our human rights and our liberties are incompatible with that kind of future. We're going to lose more than just water and food. We're going to lose our freedoms.
Another thing that we stress about population growth and overpopulation is that more people equals more regulation.
Right.
And more people and more regulation equals less freedom. So anybody who's concerned about freedom and liberty must wake up to the full truth that overpopulation is eroding away our freedom and our liberty all over the world, and especially, including in the United States. I mean, it's already eroded a lot of it in the countries where they're jam-packed, you know, like heavy population density. give you an example of heavy population density. I'm in Minnesota. The state of Wisconsin, which is right east of us here, has about less than 6 million people in Wisconsin today. Turns out that geographically, the square mileage of Wisconsin is almost identical to the square mileage of the whole country of Bangladesh. And yet, Bangladesh does not have 6 million people in it, the size of Wisconsin, or 12 million, or 24 million, or 48 million, or 96 million. There's over 150 to 160 million human beings in the country of Bangladesh, the size of Wisconsin, squeezed in, way beyond any kind of sane, sustainable, long-term sustainable population level. I'm told by experts who study Bangladesh, as well as some Bangladesh people who have immigrated here in the last few years, they say that a good 2/3 of the people in Bangladesh, so we're talking 100 million human beings just in that one country, a good 2/3 of them are struggling just to survive. I mean, they're in dire poverty straits, and they don't mean by U.S. poverty standards. We're talking about global poverty levels, which are significantly more severe.
Couple bucks a
than
day.
The definitions in the U.S.
Well, then look at Tokyo, 30 million people in one city.
Sure.
Or Mexico City, 20 million.
Right.
And
Yep,
Tokyo, they're probably got a decent standard of living, but in Mexico City, that's a shanty town in many places.
Well, sure, and of course, speaking of Tokyo, here's the interesting thing about Japan. According to the Global Footprint Network data, and they're another very good organization that does assessments every couple of years. They publish assessments of how much, what is the global footprint of people in each nation, the average global footprint of each nation on the planet, they compare that with what they call, I think they themselves have coined this word, what they call biocapacity. And what they mean by biocapacity is how biologically productive land and water and other resources that can be used for human consumption. And they compare in every nation, they put out this information that compares each nation's population level to its biocapacity level available. In other words, the available amount of resources, biologically productive land and water and resources in the country, and they compare that with the average ecological footprint of people in that country. And of course, the footprint is measuring how much people are consuming. And in globally today, when you put all that data together, their information shows that right now globally, we humans are consuming resources over 50% faster than they can be renewed. So to put it another way, in the last 12 months, we 7.2 billion humans on the planet today have consumed the renewable resources that it took the planet about 1.5 years to create.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So now, obviously the sustainable rate is if we were consuming resources that it took the planet 1 year to create. But we're over-consuming by over 50% now. And of course, that number is going up every year as another 75 million people are added to the world's population. And during the previous year, of course, because we further depleted many so-called renewable resources, rendering them closer and closer to non-renewable, as we deplete more resources every year, and as we add more population to the planet, our overshoot, what they call overshoot, becomes even greater.
Well, I was thinking about another way to put that. If you go through a year and a half, you said, with the food or whatever in a year, that would mean if you had food for a year, you'd run out after 8 months.
Exactly. That's another way of putting it. Sure.
That's not a good way to look at things.
If you were a farmer and you were living on a farm in let's say like 150 years ago, and you couldn't get out in the wintertime because you were locked in with the snow in your farm somewhere in the northern part of the U.S., and you had a year's worth of food supply, what you thought was a year's worth of food supply.
And you ran out in 8 months.
You'd run out in 8 months. And of course, another way we sometimes characterize this frankly, is to use the old farmer's terminology where they used to talk about eating your seed corn. You see, at the global level today, we, 7.2 billion people of us, we are eating the seed corn of our resources on the planet today, not just literally in food, but also in other types of resources as well.
You know, it seems to me that this overpopulation is diametrically opposed to wilderness, to biodiversity, and as we grow like that, it isn't just that we run out of food and we starve. We are, like you said, turning over land that needs to be for food, for population, where the biodiversity, which we're losing species, I don't know how many a day or a week, the effect it's having on the rest of the planet for the rest of the biosphere it's not just us that's in this game.
Oh, you're totally right, and of course, we sometimes think about we humans. It is crucial that we humans let go of our hubris that we have when it comes to taking care, truly nurturing, and truly being stewards of the planet and its resources. You're right on the money there. I mean, we're killing off. See, the only way right now, you can put it another way. The only way that right now on the planet we are growing enough food to keep over 7 billion people alive. The only way that's possible is by the fact that we are over-consuming and depleting many vital resources on the planet, like topsoil and farmland, and also by killing off, sending to extinction many, many other species, like you're pointing out. There are thousands of species that have gone extinct already, and there are others, the jaguar, the polar bear, the right whale, that are all endangered, the mountain lion, they're all endangered today. And there's a great book, by the way, too, that a friend of mine, Dave Foreman, wrote called Man Swarm, in which he focuses on the whole overpopulation issue, but he especially focuses on the loss of species. He believes that the depletion of resources on the planet, like oil and coal and fresh water and all that, while those are terrible things and alarming things, and they're going to cause great misery if we don't reduce human numbers on the planet and get back truly into balance, he believes that a much bigger crime, if you will, that we humans are creating today on the planet is the way that we are driving to extinction so many other species. As the old saying goes, extinction is forever. You know, you cannot bring back to life a species that you've driven to extinction.
Right, and that gives a whole expanded meaning to the title of your website, World Population Balance. It just isn't the balance of the world population, it's our balance with the whole biosphere and everything else that this planet, you know, envelops, or however.
Right, yep, being in balance both in terms of humans and other species and resources, you know, renewable resources and so on. It is, as I said earlier, many world leaders have been saying that the biggest challenge, problem, crisis that humanity faces on the planet today is to reduce our human numbers back to a truly sustainable level long term. Because right now we're way out of balance. So overpopulation is solvable. We are excited to help people understand that the good news, the really great news. See, by 2100, if we got average fertility rate down to about 1.5, similar to where Thailand got to a while back, if we got average fertility rate down there, by 2100, as I said earlier, we'd have about 5 billion people in the world instead of the 11 billion that the UN is predicting. And what a huge victory that would be for all of humanity to get human numbers, instead of going on up to over 10, 11 billion, we'd be back down in the 5 billion range, which is less than half. That means that we would have less than half of the impact on the resources of the planet that 11 billion will have.
David, I want to stop you for a minute. We got
About 3 minutes.
About 3 minutes. And what I want to do is kind of sum up where we are right now. First, I want to say we're the Independent Producers Organization. Jim Lockhart is my co-host. I'm Richard Carpenter. And on the phone we have David Paxton, World Population Balance. And I really have been getting some great information, and this has worked out very well to communicate like this. And so I'm going to ask in a minute or so if you can put up the replay times. They'll be playing during the
break.
The break.
Right. Well, I just want to mention one quick
Yeah,
thing. We can go a little bit over the
Yeah, go ahead.
58:32 because we have a little extra time. But I'm trying to find my notes here. It's we've talked a lot about what needs to be done, but we haven't talked about how. It seems to me that whole thing about liberty and freedoms and human rights we'll be losing in the future is a really good hook to convince people on the conservative side that something must be done, because this overpopulation isn't on anybody's agenda that I've ever seen, and we need to get people on board that at least that there's a problem.
Need to get them enthused about it.
That's right, and
This is the thing.
there must be ways that we can, because without the global media, or at least the media in this country talking about this, it's not going to get done.
Well, those are great points. We are saying at World Population Balance now all the time that there's several things. Overpopulation is solvable. What we need to do is dramatically reduce birth rates, and in order to accomplish that, we need to build a groundswell of grassroots activism, just like happened with other movements in the world, like the civil rights movement, etc. We need to have a groundswell of people who are demanding of our leaders, so-called leaders, that they need to step up to the plate, and not only our political leaders, but for example, our media people. Most media people today, mainstream media people, are also kind of kicking the can down the road. They're glossing over this issue. They're sugarcoating this issue. They're not telling the American public the full truth of the matter about how overpopulation is destroying liberty and freedom and so on, because of more regulation all the time.
Sure.
So I invite your listeners and your viewers to come to our website, join us, sign up on our pledge.
Right.
I'd love to hear from you. Send us an email, and let's start building more grassroots activism throughout the country.
Okay.
All right, David.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling in. It's been very educational.
You're welcome.
Go ahead with the play times. There, that's great.
All right.
Thank
Put that up for a couple of minutes.
Oh,
Yeah, I was thinking, we're going to fill an hour, but boy,
You are watching the Independent Producers Organization program. This program replays on these channels, at these times, and on these days. Write it down and tell your friends. You are watching the Independent Producers Organization program. This program replays on these channels, at these times, and on these days. Write it down and tell your friends.
All right, I'm plugged in and we're back. I hope folks got a chance to write down those replay times, because it'd be important to get those off to friends, because that conversation we had about population, or actually overpopulation, is a pretty important one, because it touches on so many aspects of our life. And we're going to get into a video in a couple of minutes that it's about forest issues. And you know, you might think, well, what does that have to do with population? What does that have to do with this or with that, and all the different things that are going on in the world? But the one thing I try to do on my show, Growing Concern, is to show how a lot of these issues that we talk about are really one issue with just different facets, just different faces of one issue. The global population is increasing the carbon content of the air. It's making things warmer. It's creating more forest fires. Besides creating the need for more wood products out of our forests, it's creating a warmer climate. And all this is fitting together to where, as we have seen in the newspapers and on TV just recently, our fire season is going crazy, and it's just barely July. There's 23 fires up in Washington and Oregon. There's fires all over the world. At least in the warmer parts of in the northern hemisphere right now. And so I just videotaped a presentation last night. Dominic DeSala, something like that, a fellow from Eugene. He's a scientist who just wrote a book, and he talks about forest fires. And he talks about how in different parts of the world, wildfires are different. Here they're forests. In some places they're actually agricultural fires, where the crops and things burn, or there's grass fires, or there's tundra fires. And in Russia it's forest fires like here. And the suppression that we've been doing all these years has been going about it the wrong way, and in some ways we're making it worse. And he goes into about a 30-something minute clip with a little video clip at the end, and I just threw this together. I taped it last night. And I guess he's raring to go, it sounds like. But anyway, we'll get to that. It's about 42 minutes. We'll be able to come back and have a few minutes left after this is over. But this is something I think that's really important to pay attention to.
Catch-all phrases that I use a lot is fire is to dry forest as rain is to rainforest. And I could say this because now I've got 2 books on both ends of the spectrum, and I've looked at both issues. You can't have a forest without either one, depending on where you are. If you're in a dry forest system, they need fire. If you're in a wet forest system, it needs rain. The other key message of this book that's surprising a lot of people is the large fires, not only are they not ecologically catastrophic, but they have not been increasing from historical times. Time matters. And I'll talk about that in a bit. Depends on what you choose as your baseline for comparison. If you want to go back a couple of decades, yeah, it looks like it's on the upswing. But if you go back to when the Native Americans were here, when the early explorers were coming over, there was a heck of a lot more forest burning on average during those times than we see today. And we'll talk about that as well. We're also going to be turning forest policy on its head. It needs an overhaul. It needs a facelift. Before, during, and after forest fires, there's a lot of collateral damage to these ecosystems. A lot of it is by good intention. We don't want to see people, their homes burning down or lives at risk, but there's collateral damage that we'll be discussing as well. Okay, so I had to have a dinosaur picture in there. Right? You can't have a talk without dinosaurs. And even though this is a kind of a royalty-free, tacky image there, but it kind of talks about, you know, this is a force of nature that's been around for a long time. And I always kind of laugh when I hear, well, we haven't had a fire like this in years. Fire's been burning these forests for millennia. It's been around ever since plants have been around, and it's been shaping these ecosystems as a global force of nature. And in some places a lot differently than it used to, and we'll talk about that as well. But it's not like it's all of a sudden we've got forest fires. They've been around for a very long time. So fire is no stranger to our region. This is an interesting slide showing the number of fires in the Pacific Northwest over a 2-decade period. And you can see, or 3 decades rather, you can see how much fire we have. You know, the forests in our region, the dry forests, were born to burn. And they do quite well after a forest fire, by and large. And so this is what the book really is about. It's talking about the need for a shift, a paradigm shift in the way we look at the world through the lens of fire, the language that we use, the way we treat fires before, during, and after an event. And it's a synthesis of the remarkable phoenix and how it arises out of the ashes. And it's to open up new dialogue around these fires. And as I mentioned, a bunch of scientists that I was surrounded by helped with this. Now you might be asking yourself, what does severity mean? And so when a fire happens, we classify it based on how hot the burn was, that's intensity, the heat thrown off by the fire, and that ranges from the top slide there, low, to the bottom, high. And that could be measured by the heat given off by the fire. And then there are the effects on the vegetation. And in this case, intensity begets burn severity. So the hotter the fire is burning, the more severe the effect is on the vegetation. Correspondingly, the less intense burns give you lower effects on the vegetation. And what we like to look at is the mixed severity that you see in this slide behind me. The M for moderate, the L and the U meaning low to unburned, and the high and high severity. Those are the effects on the vegetation. When an ecologist sees this, man, this is like a gravy train. This is habitat for wildlife. This kind of mosaic, this heterogeneity, is what really drives a lot of biodiversity in these fire-adapted forests. And you're going to see some of that. So we like to use this term, pyrodiversity begets biodiversity. Essentially, it's that mosaic pattern that I showed you. You can see the different burn severities that I put on the slide here, high, medium, unburned, and low. And when you got that kind of mixture, you've got a lot of really great wildlife habitat. This is from the Biscuit Fire in Southwest Oregon. I took this photo 10 years after the burn. And this is after Senator Smith at the time said, oh my God, it's a moonscape, it'll never come back. It'll never be a forest again. And you know, lo and behold, at least 10 years after, you see a lot of plants coming back in this burn area. Same thing for the Rim Fire down in the Sierra, just outside of Yosemite National Park. Same calls, moonscape, catastrophe, the forest will never come back. And I'll show you later on, we've had field crews on the ground actually seeing something very different. And this kind of mosaic pattern, great wildlife habitat. You got habitat in there for old growth species in the areas that were lightly burned, and habitat in there for the species that come in when a new forest is developing, and everything in between. This is what we like to see in nature. And in nature, variety is a good thing. Variety is the spice of life, and is the spice of biodiversity. And you know, I'm sure you're familiar with this one out by Mount Hood. Same kind of pattern. Mixed severity burn, all kinds of different fire-affected vegetation in there, and wonderful habitat for wildlife. Certainly not an ecological catastrophe. It might look that way, especially if it burned down your favorite hiking place and your campground, but when you look at just the ecological effects, it's not a catastrophe. And so time since fire matters. In 1988, there was the big Yellowstone fire. I was on the ground right when it was happening, right after it happened, and the news coverage was, oh my God, the park will never be the same. The park was destroyed by this fire, which affected a third of the Yellowstone ecosystem. The red you see there are areas that burned in high intensity, and this is what it looked like initially. This is what the Yellowstone burn looked like. Really nice, interesting mosaic that you see in these mixed severity burns. And here's what it looked like about 10 years later. Certainly the park wasn't destroyed, and I was on the ground a couple of years right after the fire, and there were lodgepole seedlings above my knee height. Let's just hold the questions to the very end, okay? Otherwise I forget what I'm going to say. So there were seedlings up to my knees. There was all kinds of wildflowers. The elk were loving it. There were woodpeckers all over the place. The park wasn't destroyed. Time since fire matters. If you go in right after the event, it looks like a catastrophe. It's blackened, the soils are cooked, there's no life on the ground. If you come back sometimes as soon as the next spring, it's incredibly alive, and you'll see that in some of the other pictures. So nature has prepared these forests to burn, and there's a lot of ways that these forests are built for fire. The picture on the top is from the redwood system, and redwood, particularly the sequoia, is the most fire-resistant conifer in the world. It can live with fire in its crowns. That doesn't mean it's always going to be that way, but these big trees are very insulated bark. It's like a living asbestos. The fire comes in, hits the bark, keeps going, tree survives, and actually does a nice job of clearing out the understory, so you get these sequoia seedlings that come back that depend on the fire. That's called fire resistance, when you have something like insulated bark. Then you've got resilience, the ability of the forest to come back after a forest fire. Lodgepole pine seedlings, knobcone pine seedlings in our region need intense fire to burst open their cones. The seeds cover the ground, come right out of the ashes. That's how it regenerates. Without fire, you don't have a regenerating system. Resilience and resistance is part of the story of Born to Burn. Okay, so you look at these two slides, the first thing you may think, oh man, that's a beautiful forest on this side. Wow, that's a really neat place to go hiking. So's this one. Now, it might not look like that right after the burn, but I guarantee you come back a year or two and that place is going to have very high levels of bird richness and all kinds of other critters in it, and that's what we see in nature. And again, if I showed images to people and didn't tell them, which do you like, the green or the black, and I guarantee you about everybody would say the green forest. Both are important, and I'll show you why. So here's what we see in the studies and the data that have been done in many places around the world. If you graph the complexity of the forest on one axis and the number of species on the other axis, we have very high levels of biodiversity in the forest that just burned, which is very similar to the levels of biodiversity we see in the much more celebrated old-growth forests. They're just different critters that occupy both ends of that successional gradient. A lot of people know the best places to go get morels is in a burn area. All kinds of insects, bats, birds, woodpeckers, deer, wonderful wildflowers, butterflies. The place is just alive. It's alive with sounds. It's alive with nature rejuvenating itself. Not a catastrophe. And so what we were able to do is we put together this letter that was signed by over 250 scientists, sent it off to members of Congress that were involved in passing a really bad bill in the House back in 2013 after the Rim Fire burn to basically suspend most of the nation's environmental laws so they can get in there and salvage log after the fire. It's happening again. The House is going to be voting on this tomorrow, I believe, at a committee to pass another bill that would suspend environmental laws to go into these areas, salvage log them, and plant them because they view that as a catastrophe. So, but this letter had a lot to do with slowing that down, and we're going to be sending a new one real soon to Congress with the same kind of message. So if I had to pick a species that would symbolize these burn areas, if I had to pick the spotted owl of burned areas, my favorite would be the blackback woodpecker. You're going to see a film of this at the very end. Notice that coloration of its back. Notice the coloration of the charred tree. It was born to be in these forests. It comes back right after the burn. And it'll stay in those forests and nest in those forests, feed on the beetle grubs for about 4 to 5 years. And then it'll move on to the next burn area because it really likes the young stuff coming back, that area that has been then affected by beetle grubs that is within the first 4 or 5 years after a forest fire, then it's gone. The map you see on the right there is the Sierra system showing how little habitat in black is left for that species because of fire suppression and post-fire logging has eliminated its habitat. It's now under consideration for the Endangered Species Act protections because populations have been crashing because of the suppression and salvage logging that's happening. So it would be a really good indicator species of the complexity of these forests because they don't occur when we log. So here is an interesting finding. Spotted owls, everybody knows they occur in old growth forests. What's really been a surprise finding is that the species also uses these burned areas more than we thought. And what we're finding across the 3 subspecies, the California, the Mexican, and somewhat the northern spotted owl, although we know less about that species in burn areas, is they will nest and roost in burn patches and they will forage in the high intensity burn patches. So as long as there's enough unburned patches in a big fire, a mosaic, they'll hang out and they'll nest. So they kind of look at those live trees as their bedroom and they look at the burned trees as their kitchen because that's where the prey is. The vegetation's coming back, small mammals are coming back, the kitchen's open for business. So that's what we're seeing with this species. It may be more resilient to forest fires than we think, it's not very resilient to post-fire logging. That's really the big concern is when you take out the habitat or if the fires start to increase to the point where it outpaces the old growth that's eventually coming in from forest succession, then we have a problem. But right now it doesn't seem to be a problem for this species. So here's the next big thing on everybody's mind. Are the really big fires increasing across the West? You hear the term megafire and big fire and large fire. And so we tried to define this because it means a lot of different things to just about everybody. Some people define big fires as 2,000 acres. Some of them define big fires as watershed scale fires. So we used an ecological definition and said, okay, we're only going to look at big fires greater than 120,000 acres. Those are the really big ones. Let's take a look and see if those are on the increase. That slide on this part of the slide here, what you see in the green blobs, those are the really big fires since 1984, and they occur in just about all different kinds of plant communities. It's not just forest, it's grasslands, it's shrublands, it's chaparral, it's oak woodlands, and it's forests. So it's not just forest. That's the reason why that graph is up there, is to show you that they occur in all vegetation types. Okay, so we've got some data. We can go back and take a look at these really big fires since 1997. No trend there. So no trend since 1997. But if we go back to the 1980s, there has been an increase recently in the big fires. Is that long enough? No. Because, and also one other thing is we don't see any trend in the increase in the severity of fires. So we've got acres burning and we've got the big severe burns. There's no trend in the severe fires. There's a slight increase in the big fires since 1984, but it's not enough time. And the reason why is if we go even further back in time, 1880s, and look at the general land surveys, we look at the original historical accounts of European settlers coming through, we look at the documents that they put together in archives, they were talking about really big fires. The 1910 Montana fires were huge. So we know these fires have been occurring for a long time and they follow the cycles in climate. So I mean, here's a photograph from archives, the historic archives of the 1910 fires in Montana. Big fire, lots of high severity in that, and we see something very similar today, especially when we're in a drought cycle, in a warming period. We're seeing these big fires that look like that. So severity hasn't changed. The big fires really haven't changed if you go far enough back in time, but there's been a recent increase. So just kind of keep that in mind, because everybody focuses on the recent, and you don't go back far enough in time to see that we actually had more acres burning in the 1880s. And so here's the other question. Is it following a climate signal? This graph goes back further into 1920. These aren't big fires. This is all fire acres. All acres burned going back to 1920. Look at the pattern there. From 1920 on, looks like we had a suppression effect. But also what was going on then is the climate was cooler. From about the 1920s to 1960 or so, we were in a cool phase of what's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the El Nino, and the patterns that affect these big climate events, where we were in a cool phase and the fires were down. We also had doing a lot of fire suppression and the fires were down. We're now entering a warm phase and the fires are up again. What we don't have is what's on the other side of that graph. The 1880s, the 1800s, when there was a lot more fire burning. So naturally, if you look at this, oh my God, we're really in a bad situation. If you look at this, oh yeah, it used to be burning more, but now it's back up. And most people don't look at the paleo information, the general land surveys, and see that we're actually not that out of whack. There's concern, but we're not that out of whack. Not yet. And here's why. This is what determines fire behavior. A lot of fire ecologists have focused on this part, the fuel or vegetation and topography, how it burns differently. If you're in steep terrain or if you're in gradual terrain, the fire will be burning differently. That affects fire behavior. And then we know climate is a big one. And so as the climate changes, this is going to be more important and this is going to be less important. And that has a really interesting message for how to manage the landscape, because a lot of the focus is on this, but unless you solve climate change, it's not really going to make that big of a difference as we get more and more warming as the century progresses, unless we do something about climate change. Okay, so now we're going to get into the management stuff. What to do about these burns before, during, and after a fire event. So we're going to shift gears from how wonderful these and remarkable these forest fires are to what we're actually doing in terms of collateral damage. This is not a criticism of any of the good work firefighters are doing to protect homes or lives, but it is to point out that there are significant collateral damages when you see this kind of fire suppression going on in wilderness areas, in roadless areas, in places that, and most of those fires should be let to burn on their own under safe conditions. So the collateral damages are often severe, again with good intention. We're worried about homes, we're worried about lives, but there are very big collateral damages that we're seeing, and especially from the dumping of aerial retardants, which are toxic to watersheds, toxic to amphibians, and you can see the rising costs of fire suppression. The Forest Service in some years, their budget approaches half their total budget in fire suppression, and you can see the numbers there. All agencies totaling over $4 billion in fire suppression costs, and with very little transparency, very little oversight. Congress just writes a blank check and says go out there and suppress forest fires, and in some cases we want that, right? We don't want homes burning, and maybe we need to focus more on the suppression where it's more effective around homes and lives, and less so in the backcountry burning under extreme weather events, because the forest fires can't be put out by suppression when burning under extreme weather events like drought and high winds. But I just wanted to put that up there to show you how much taxpayer money is being spent on suppression and having very little effect on the big fires. Does a good job with the small fires, but not the big fires. So let's take a look at after a forest fire. This is the biscuit burn using an image enhancer of fire intensity right after the burn. The red area is high intensity burn. It's actually interesting. When this Google image was taken and when the map was classified into burn severities, the spring after that, a lot of these red patches actually had trees coming back. So you need to go back and remap those the spring after a forest fire, because a lot of those trees that are classified by remote sensing are classified as dead, but they're not dead yet, to use the Monty Python phrase, I'm not dead yet. So you go back in the spring and they're flushing new growth. But the satellite imagery in the fall, when the fire was burning, caught the brown needles, classified it as dead, when in fact the trees, a lot of them were actually alive. And we're seeing that in a lot of places like the Sierra. We saw it in the Biscuit and a few other forest fires, that you got to come back in the spring and reclassify these maps, because they're not the best way to classify fires. So again, looking at the Biscuit, this is really an interesting slide that I want to show you here. I took this picture in 2002. This is a late successional reserve that was supposed to be protected for spotted owls under the Northwest Forest Plan. Post-fire logging, 10 years later, not much conifer regeneration. Not much has come back. Here's right upslope of that is a botanical area. You notice the big trees are still there. Not any logging. Look at the kind of conifer regeneration that's come back. Now they say they need to do this because the forest can't come back unless they come back and plant. This was planted and it didn't come back. And a lot of that has to do with the soil conditions, the exposure to sunlight. These dead trees are providing some shade. They're like a big umbrella out there for these little seedlings so they don't get cooked in the sunlight. You take that away and you've lost that connection between life and death in the forest that's part of that whole dynamic of change that allows you to have the new forest that comes back after a forest fire. And we take out the most important elements. Another thing that post-fire logging will do is it'll leave behind the little stuff. These slash piles, we know that when a reburn occurs, which happened in the Biscuit, it was salvage logged in a portion in 1987. And then the fire went through the same area in 2002, and it just cooked. It blew up because of the slash that's left behind, the small material. Now you can get rid of that slash. You can burn it, and you can do this, which can have impacts to soils, which are at a very fragile state to begin with. It takes more than a human lifetime for soils to actually have enough of the humus and the richness in them to support a forest. And this kind of activity, especially if it's on steep slopes, can have decades of impacts to soils. Okay, and here's a rimfire. Yosemite National Park is out here. This is a 2013 Google image. You could see the smoke from the rimfire that was burning. You could see the size of the fire perimeter. Over 257,000 acres were burning in that fire. What I often hear is, oh, if we only could log the forest to reduce the fuels, the fires wouldn't burn as intensely. Take a look at that image. And so we haven't finished the analysis yet, but the preliminary work we've done on the rimfire shows that the hottest burn intensities occurred in the areas that were heavily logged. They burn the hottest. We've seen that in a couple of other places, like the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion down in southwest Oregon, Northern California. The fires burn uncharacteristically hot when they hit the slash, when they hit the plantations, the trees are densely packed. It's like kindling to the fire, and that's actually doing the reverse of what they're trying to prevent. And so what happens in these post-fire logging over and over again, the biological legacies are taken out, which give you that shade effect to the conifers that are coming back, and the slash is left behind, or it's treated with burn piles. So here's a really interesting cool stuff that we've been finding in the rimfire. We heard right about the time the rimfire, the Forest Service did a field tour. We went out on the field tour. They said, oh my God, the burn was so intense in these areas, the trees aren't going to come back. In the really intense burn patches, we're not going to have conifer establishment. Well, we challenged that assumption. We sent some crews out there, and we saw this right after the fire. And we saw this right after the fire. Plentiful conifer establishment. The graph you see up top is inside a big burn patch of high intensity, and you can see plenty of seedlings that are coming back, even as far back as 600 meters from the nearest green tree. So we don't know exactly how that's happening. We think animals are bringing in the seeds. We think there's some wind dispersal going on. But it certainly doesn't look like the forest can't come back even in these intensely burned patches. And this is actually in peer review right now. The other thing we see with post-fire logging is the bigger the fire, the bigger the post-fire logging proposal. And that's only going to set these systems up for bigger fires. So we get into this feedback loop of priming the fire pump by transposing the ecosystem from fire adapted to fire prone. We saw this in the Rim Fire when the Forest Service did their documentation. Oh, we're only going to log 11% of the forest. We're going to leave the other 88% or 89% alone. Yeah, but you're logging in every single occupied spotted owl habitat or territory and most of the snag forest. That's where all the biodiversity is. So it's focused on where the big trees are, but you don't get that when you use the wrong scale to assess your impacts. We saw that on the Biscuit Fire. Well, we're only going to log 4% of the entire area. Yeah, but 70% of it was in the reserves, 52% in roadless areas, 55% in watersheds connecting to wild and scenic rivers. Now, they didn't get away with this, but that's what was proposed initially. They went through lawsuit after lawsuit, and they didn't get nearly as much, but that's to show you how bold the post-fire logging is corresponding to the size of the fire event. Same thing with the Klamath West Side Fire Recovery Project. We're only going to log 100, well, the fire was this size. We're only going to log 22% of it. But most of the really important stuff, like the reserves, the roadless areas, is where the logging is targeted. That's the least, that's the most fragile place and the worst possible place you could be doing logging after a forest fire. Okay, so what do we do about this? We're winding down in the last couple of slides. So bear with me, and then you're going to see a really cool film for 8 minutes. So it's complicated. And I've been doing several news media interviews this week about this because there's a fire burning on the Olympic Peninsula now in the rainforest. And there's fires burning in Washington and a lot of other places right now. And they want to know, what do we do about this? Well, in the case of fire, you can actually compartmentalize a fire when it's burning. You can treat some of it for suppression. You can let some of it burn depending on weather factors. It's an art and it's a science. But what we are hoping to see more of, and we see this with national parks, is called MIST, Minimum Impact Suppression Tactics. MIST. So if you're going to blade a fire line, you're going to blade the narrowest fire line possible, and then you're going to go back and restore that in its natural state. If you're in a wilderness, you're in a roadless area, and you're using suppression, use MIST. There are other ways to do this, but that's just one example. We get into the flammable tree plantations. First of all, stop converting more of our native forest, our old-growth forest, to this, because it's flammable and it's priming the fire pump. And for the ones that we've already done, this is where I think thinning can make a difference. What do we do about this? We have incredible sprawl. In Montana alone, the fire suppression costs on average are about $20 to $30 million a year. With sprawl and climate change, that's projected to increase by the middle of the century to billions of dollars. Fighting fires, because we've got more and more people that are loving this place to death. It's a great thing, get out in the wild, but we need better land use zoning, because more of that is going to just make the suppression issue even more costly, both financially and in terms of ecological damage. Prescribed burning at lower elevations, that should help under moderate conditions, but as we've seen, eventually that climate signal is going to start taking over and pushing more fires in the direction of being driven by extreme weather events and less so by fuels at the bottom-up level. So just keeping that in mind, there's just so much we could do unless we solve for climate change. So here's a Google image of my home. So we use this in the book as an example of what we call homeland fire security. And homeland fire security involves, first of all, defining a fire shed. So I live in the Anderson Creek watershed, and the fire shed consists of all my neighbors in that watershed. And we know from studies that have been done all around the world, and especially in the Western North America, in Forest and Chaparral, if you treat this zone by building with fire-resistant material, it's kind of like the story of the big bad wolf, and you know, which house is the wolf going to blow down? Build with a tin roof, your house is going to have a lot higher chance of going through a fire event. Thin out the vegetation, your house is going to have a lot better chances of going through a fire event. And so actually, if you reduce vegetation in a circle of about 200 feet, depending on slope and aspect, you're going to have about a 90% or greater chance of surviving these kinds of fires. That's been shown in many places around the world. If you're doing logging in the backcountry, it doesn't change the odds on any of these homes. And you can see that some of them are quite vulnerable. This one's looking pretty good. Here's my house. I could probably do a better job in here, but you know, I've actually gone in and thinned out all the lower branches up to as far as I can get a pole saw so that I can't get a crown fire going in and then taking out my house. So there are ways to get around this. There's a lot of information on Firewise Homes. This is a good way to coexist with fire in the wildlands. Okay, so here's the wrap. So point number one, large fires. They're really not eco-disasters. They're not catastrophes of nature. There's certainly a human element. Nobody likes smoke. Nobody likes to see a fire barreling down near anybody's home or firefighters at risk. But this is the untold story. So we need to purge that catastrophe speak. We need a new dialogue on these fires that actually looks at them as nature's phoenix. You can't solve for the fire problem without solving for the cause, global warming. And as we continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere, we're going to see more of these fires driven by extreme weather behavior, and extremes may become the new norm in a lot of places in the West, and more of these fires may be the new norm unless we resolve that issue. And coexistence is possible. We talked about how to coexist using different approaches to fire, and the real catastrophe is that. It's the post-fire logging that happens after the fire event. It's not the nature's phoenix. It's actually setting back the rejuvenation. So that's the formal part of the presentation. What we're going to do now is there's a really cool video that goes for about 8 minutes. And the speaker on this, the guy that did the ecology, is one of the guys that wrote one of the chapters in the book. Richard Hutto, who's a avian ecologist, has been studying forest fires for many years in Montana, and finding some really extraordinary stuff.
The 7 miles in 35 minutes, and it left everything on fire at once. The heat's just unbelievable. And it's so hot it's melted steel.
It is an ember storm. It is blindness. It is choking. Fire is chaos.
Place is just ash and rock. And you go in there and look, and you just shake your head. Why?
A serious concern would be rapid moving fire through the valley. And we were given a direction through the delegation of authority to the incident commander on how to go about managing.
Protect private property over to the west, but not at the expense of public safety or personnel safety. Homes can be rebuilt, lives can't. Hopefully, we never have this.
Much recovery efforts last weekend.
An awful lot of death and destruction happens because people are not prepared. That is a tragedy that comes from chaos.
Tanker 454, Russell out, Washington. 454, go ahead. You feel like you'll be able to hit the target that we need?
devastating. That is the essence of disturbance. And the disturbance ecology is about death.
If you apply a natural source, a natural process, like fire, to a natural system, you're likely to yield a natural result.
The ground looks pretty much like a blackened carpet, but it isn't long before you begin seeing things sprouting up. It's amazing. There's some plants that'll have seeds that'll sit waiting for this opportunity to germinate and throw out another generation. So the trees are dead, of course, after the fire. And they look like solid charcoal, but they're not. It's just the bark that's basically blackened. Beneath that bark, there's fine wood. And now that the tree is defenseless, beetles have a heyday and numbers skyrocket. You know, where are these things coming from? These beetles, you know, that can detect heat for up to 100 miles away have already honed in on these places and have laid eggs on these trees, and their larvae are beginning to develop inside the trees. It's remarkable. I mean, they're talking to us. They're telling us something about what historically occurred. And so I think we're risking a great amount of error when we say that these kinds of stand replacement fires didn't occur in the past and they're catastrophic.
Most of these animals travel a great distance to get into these burns. Boreal toads come into these burns by the hundreds, sometimes by the thousands. We're not sure why they're here. It's probably the food, but we don't really know. There is so much to learn about these burned forests.
Coming upon a fire-dependent species like the blackback woodpecker is really pretty thrilling. It's apparent that its coloration matches the background of these severely burned trees and is as impressive as looking at a white-tailed ptarmigan in snow or a polar bear against polar ice. I mean, this is a reflection of a long evolutionary history of this bird with that kind of environment, and that's a severely burned forest.
It's been talked about since the turn of the century. Fire ecologists recognize the benefit for a long time.
In the wilderness, we have chosen to not suppress all the fires, and what we've seen out there is it's created this mosaic of different fire patterns from different years. And then what we see over time is that the next fire that starts poses less of a risk because it burns into an old fire scar.
You know, the more fire we've had in the landscape, the easier it is to contain these fires. We can use fewer crews because there's lower fuel loading, there's lower flame lengths. If you've got areas that have burned around you in the last 10, 15 years, the newer the fire, say a fire from 2 years ago, would be just impenetrable by a new fire. There's nothing to burn.
So we have tons of beetle larvae now developing in these dead trees. And this is why these woodpeckers come into the burned forest. The main prey item for these woodpeckers that come in are not the bark beetles that are just beneath the bark, but the wood-boring beetles. These burrow deeper into the tree. While they're in the trees, they can get pretty big, like you know, an inch long or something like that. I mean, these grubs are fantastic food. The beetle larvae take 2 to 3 years to mature, then emerge, and then kind of the game's over. And so the blackback woodpeckers have to find some other place, basically, and that's a severely burned forest. And this is the sort of thing that's happened for millennia. I mean, it's nothing unusual. It's nothing that hasn't happened before.
Systems change. Trees grow, they age, they die, they burn up, or you'll have pockets of high severity, then pockets of low severity. And you get a tremendous diversity in the system through that mixed severity kind of fire regime.
These burns are a hot spot for butterflies. Some of these burns have 3 and 4 times the number of species than an unburned forest.
It's pretty amazing. There's a whole suite of biological plays being carried out in this landscape. And you can begin to feel the energy of the early years just after fire. To make you believe disturbance has a role in the natural system, you can't get so freaked out.
I found that very interesting. I hope viewers did too. That event was put on by BARC, at www.bark-out.org, organization I've been involved with since its beginning, and it was put on at the Patagonia building, which is downtown at 9th and Irving. And they usually just do sports events, but they decided they're going to BARC talked them into doing something like this, and the place got filled up. It was quite a bit of interest because they're mostly environmentalists, not adventurists. But I found that pretty interesting, and I just put the gist of it on there. I mean, he gave a really nice talk beforehand, but like I said, the images were terrible because he was standing in front of the light with the light behind him. Anyway, there was just so much to talk about there. He actually mentioned a fire that was here in Clackamas. You remember when that fire was up at the Clackamas River last year, Milepost 36 fire? It burned and the Clackamas was closed for a while, and I remember driving out that way and you could see the fire, you could see the smoke for miles. It was, it was a pretty good sized fire. And I went up there with BARC, early in the spring, and trilliums were, it's hot. It just, if you know what vine maple is, it just fried vine maple. It was all just gnarled over. Everything was burnt to a crisp. The ferns were burnt to the ground. But right in the middle of it all, in, March or April, trilliums were coming up. Ferns were coming up. Oh, yeah. And just a few months later. I think a lot of the trees and things that were dead aren't going to come back. But if I was to go in there right now, I bet you some of them would come back. And you go in there with a machine and stomp the soil down and tear it all up and cut the trees down and all that. And like they said, you replant after you log and it doesn't come in very well. Whereas you just leave it alone, let it naturally regenerate, like Mount St. Helens. One woman brought that up during.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, one woman brought that up during the Q&A, and it came back, and what did they say was the first? He said in the Q&A, the first thing that came back was spiders, because they come in on their webs. They fly in on their webs because they're so light. The webs are like a balloon, and they bring them in. Because I don't know what the hell they ate. They were the first things in there.
Not too much.
Not too much. There's not much to eat. But we were talking about the population explosion on this planet earlier and how it affects the biodiversity of the planet. And that he mentioned a beetle that can sense heat from 100 miles away and move in. These are some of the equipment and the expertise that nature has, and it's something as insignificant as a little insect. And just think of all the power and wonder that is in these miracles that are in these creatures that we are driving extinct just because we're here and we want to have it all. And the population, I first thought about it as this overpopulation is going to hurt humanity. To the hell with humanity. We're the problem. We're the cancer.
Yeah, that's right.
The planet will survive one way or the other without us. It's survived a lot of mass extinctions in the past. And when mankind has only been around, as the anthropologists say, a couple of million years. And if we go away, what remains will continue. So it's kind of hubris the guy used. What was his name? Dave Paxton. He used the word hubris. That's just about what it is. You know, what got me involved in activism and then in cable access was the environment. You know, seeing, you know, what actually forests, going up there cutting firewood and running the dogs. Had a couple big dogs, and then I started realizing, well, those clear cuts are kind of really good for getting up there and getting firewood, and they're good for being able to see, you know, a distance because if trees are gone, but there's an awful lot of them out there, and look at all the sediment being washed into the streams and all the different consequences of the logging. I finally started waking up that we're doing more damage than we need to be doing with this, and cheap wood, as does cheap gas, it drives the consumerism, which creates the population, like we were talking about.
You know, I was thinking about where, over in Africa or somewhere, the women have to walk miles to get wood, or I don't even know if it's Africa, but I know there are some places they have to walk miles to get wood, not to mention water.
I think China in the past has been that way, because, you know, they've been civilized there in that one area for they had a term, farmers of 40 centuries or something like that. They've been, you know, on that land for thousands and thousands of years, and of course they will probably deplete.
So that takes away...
Deplete the water and the resources.
It takes away more forest.
Right, little by little, you know. Of course, in the Old West, they used buffalo dung. The Indians did a lot, because, you know, they didn't have forests out in the Great Plains. They used buffalo dung.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you use what's around, but like we were saying, you know, you have cheap wood, you have cheap gas, you have all these cheap commodities that don't factor in the real costs. You know, you can get a 2x4 for a couple of bucks, but that isn't factoring in the fact that it's what it's done to the forest, and the fact that the global warming, you know, because of the getting, because he talked about that, getting the carbon sink of the trees. The trees are holding all that carbon in, and when they die, they release it. And so all that is it's being driven by our everything is so cheap, but it doesn't factor the long-term results. And now, after 30 or 40 years, some of these long-term results, you know, the carbon dioxide is just one of the many things that the chickens are coming home into roost right now. But the population has been going up because, you know, gas was cheap, building materials were cheap. You could build a house really easy. Gas, electricity and all these things were cheap, but we were destroying the salmon in order to do that. And all of a sudden, you know, down the road, we're starting to realize that there was a price to pay for all that inexpensive stuff.
Every one of those things.
Mm-hmm. And it's happening right now. And so, there was one more point here. We're down to about 4 minutes here, and we talk about this forest is a wasteland because it's been burned. But that guy said 3 to 4 times the species are in a burnt forest than an unburnt forest. Because Hello? What's going on?
Yes.
So I don't know what that was about. Maybe there was a phone call or something that didn't come through. But anyway, lost my train of thought there. So you were able to watch some of that. Was it pretty interesting? Did you learn some things that you hadn't thought about before?
You mean, watching this?
Yeah.
I was mostly kind of got me how barren the dirt and everything was. So when they got through with it, I just thought, well, will it ever come back to that?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there's other ways of getting seeds and things around. Same reason islands get.
Oh yeah.
Things. Stuff moves across, moves from the land up the mountain.
Sure, bird dung brings it across the ocean, and they deposit it in the islands, or it floats on balsa wood rafts or whatever. Right. It's all a living, moving thing.
That's right. So this stuff always keeps growing. You wonder how that could happen. When is it there? The only time it doesn't grow It's when it's lava. It's been from volcanoes.
Volcanoes. That pretty well buries the whole thing there.
Yeah, yeah. That isn't a whole lot of it. And then I think dirt blows. I think dirt blows.
Sure, dirt blows in, and also when plants get a foothold in there, plants, their roots break down. Because, you know, basically soil is just rock that has been, minerals that have been broken down over the centuries.
Yeah.
And a lot of it washes down, of course, you know, because it's all in movement. It's all in movement, whether it's the soil moving down the mountains or the soil moving to the ocean, and the hydraulic cycles and all those different things. And now the scientists are starting to figure it out, but the Forest Service and the politicians don't listen to the scientists. They listen to the timber industry and the mining industry and the cattle industry, but they don't listen to the scientists.
The fertilizer thing, I was concerned about that. Well, wait a minute. If fertilizer is going from everywhere into the streams and then back out to us, and what about the condition of the fish and the shellfish and the whales and everything? Those are going to suffer.
We start understanding the connectedness of everything.
Oh, it's completely.
Or the phosphorus gets into the soil and gets into the water and creates algae blooms, which suck all the oxygen out of the water, and then things die because of that. They can't breathe, because, you know, all animals, whether it's through their exoskeleton or their gills or their lungs or whatever, take in oxygen, you know, and or carbon dioxide, which would be what plants do. They take in carbon dioxide and give out oxygen, and we do just the opposite. Nice balance there when it's working right.
Right.
So we're down about 48 seconds. That was a quick bit. Thank our crew. We always try to thank our crew. I don't always remember. They're in there doing their job, sometimes very loudly,
making it all
work.
Possible.
So we're back with the second Wednesday of every month. We don't really have exactly down what we're going to do next month, but we'll come up with something. Hopefully we'll maybe even get some producers to come in there to talk a little bit about their show.
Yeah.
I had one tonight, but he wasn't able to make it, so we'll try it again next month. But in any event, thanks again for the crew. I want to thank Dave Paxton and Dominic for that great video that presentation last night, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.